Chapter 4, Slavery, Freedom, and the Struggle for Empire, is going to wrap up our look at Period 2, which ends roughly before the Revolution, and we're going to have the conclusion be the French and Indian War here, which is where we'll end up today. So, in looking at this chapter, we're going to study the different variations on slavery throughout the colonies and how slavery led to different African American cultures developing in the future United States. We'll look at conceptions of freedom and how those had effects on institutions in colonial society. We'll look at big movements like the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. And like I say, we will finally end on the French and Indian War and how the immediate aftermath of that sets us up for the conditions that will lead to the American Revolution beginning in period 3. So the first question, how did African slavery differ regionally in 18th century North America? So important to keep in mind that despite later moral outrage, the slave trade was a key part of the Atlantic world in the 1700s and was widely morally accepted by whites. So enslaved people were exported by West African nations that had enslaved people from the interior of Africa. They were exported to Europeans like the Portuguese, the Spanish, later the Dutch and the British. And then these would be transported across the Atlantic in the tightly packed, inhumane conditions of the so-called Middle Passage across the Atlantic. Now, many, or rather I should say, most enslaved people were being kidnapped and exported to parts of the Spanish New World Empire in the Caribbean and so on. A much smaller number came to the North American English colonies. Nonetheless, in the Chesapeake Bay area, tobacco-based plantation slavery was the norm. Slaves lived and worked on relatively small plantations, and although most were used as agricultural laborers or field hands, some slaves certainly did do specialized or skilled work. So, for example, a pretty notable colonist later on, Thomas Jefferson, who himself was a slaver, even though he pushed the idea of African American intellectual inferiority, his own Virginia plantation, Monticello, had slaves trained as blacksmiths, shoemakers, bricklayers, coopers, carpenters, engineers, artisans, midwives, and even physicians. So that kind of flies in the face of his ideology. So slaves mostly performed unskilled labor, but they could certainly perform skilled labor as well. Over time, after the transition towards slavery after Bacon's Rebellion, slavery was increasingly legally codified or written into the law and really kind of fleshed out in terms of the legal boundaries and definitions of slavery and the life of a slave. Rice and indigo-based plantation slavery was the norm further south of the Chesapeake Bay colonies, places like South Carolina and Georgia. These plantations were much larger and tended to have, of course, larger slave populations. They also made use of a slightly different labor system in the sense that they used something called the task system, where slaves would be allowed personal or leisure time as soon as their assigned tasks were completed. It was still coerced, unpaid labor. It was horrible, but it was different from being forced to work sun up to sundown constantly, in theory. Slavery, despite its later prohibition in parts of the North, was common in the middle colonies and New England. They just typically did not work on plantations because plantations were not central to the economy of these regions. So there were fewer slaves. They were considered to be less important to northern economies, certainly compared to southern ones. And slaves would work in a variety of roles. They could work as field hands, as domestic servants, skilled laborers, etc. Because there were fewer slaves, there was thus less of a fear of slave uprisings, so the laws tended to be fewer and less harsh. Again, because smaller populations of slaves weren't considered to pose as much of a threat to whites. Importantly, physical and sexual abuse of slaves was very common. Arbitrary violence was more or less necessary from the perspective of whites to uphold the system. After all, in some parts of the colonies, slaves outnumbered their white slavers. Rape and sexual abuse was common. I mentioned in an earlier chapter that the children of slaves became slaves because the Chesapeake Bay colonies had set the standard that someone with any African heritage was considered black and thus a slave. So the status is really passed through the mother. It's slavery that is matrilineal. So if a white man rapes a slave, that's another slave for this. They kind of have a financial incentive to sexually exploit their slaves. Um, if a white woman slept with a slave, their child would be free, and thus laws were passed to prohibit such sexual intermingling. Um, but again, it was common and accepted for a white man to sexually assault and rape his female slaves. Um, a good example of the offspring of one of these relationships would be Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings was a slave of Thomas Jefferson who would later become kind of like a wife for him once his wife passed. She was still a slave. All of the children that Jefferson fathered with Hemings were slaves as well. And interestingly enough, just to sort of demonstrate how common this was, Sally Hemings was actually Thomas Jefferson's wife's slave and also her half sister. Because Thomas Jefferson's father-in-law had raped one of his slaves. The offspring of that was Sally Hemings, who was given to his daughter as her slave, which then passed into Jefferson's possession once he got married to her. So this kind of rape was incredibly common, and it was also actually common for male slaves to be raped in a process that was referred to as buck breaking. The idea that especially independent slaves or those that were seen to pose some kind of threat would be raped publicly, oftentimes in front of their families and their sons, in order to break theoretically unruly slaves. So sexual abuse was a means of control and exploitation and was every bit as common as beatings and whippings and things of that nature. Secondly, what factors led to distinct African American cultures in the 18th century? So, depending on their contact or intermingling with whites, African slaves preserved varying degrees of their own cultures. Importantly, central to African American culture was the development of different means of resistance to their enslavement. You have two basic forms here. You've got passive resistance to slavery versus active resistance to slavery. Passive resistance was the most common. It was the most successful because it was the version that did not make use of violence. That's active resistance. Active resistance, which was less common, meant striking an overseer. It meant killing your master. It meant rising up in revolt. These things were not really successful, so they were usually avoided in favor of passive resistance. This included things like running away, trying to preserve your own culture, trying to form a family. It also involved anything that could slow down plantation routine. Work slowdowns, work stoppages, breaking tools, pretending not to understand instructions, all of those things were central to African American culture as means of resistance against their enslavement. Now, I said active resistance was less common because it was more risky and, well, never successful. But there is one good example of a slave uprising in the colonial period. This is called the Stono Rebellion. Stono Rebellion happens in 1739 in South Carolina, where slaves rose up against their slavers, killed them, and tried to escape to Spanish Florida, where they thought they could uh, find refuge among local Native American tribes. Um, they were stopped and killed by colonial militia, which is kind of illustrative of how these efforts rarely, if ever, actually worked. Right. Number three, what were the meanings of British liberty in the 18th century? A big theme of Eric Foner's textbook is how did Americans define freedom at different points and in different contexts? And it's a really great way to understand American history and to put really everybody's actions into perspective. So freedom means different things to different people at different times. So it's always important to kind of check in and understand what did it mean to be free at this time to these people? And that gives a lot of context to people's actions. So British liberty or British freedom in the 18th century was considered to be ruled by the people. So republicanism, also called liberal freedom, was a central value in the conception of British liberty. It was the belief that the government should be based on the consent of the governed. Republicanism was largely based on the ideas of an English Enlightenment philosopher named John Locke. He believed that people had certain natural rights or liberties that you were just born with because you're a human being, and that it was the government's responsibility to protect those rights. Locke further said that if the government doesn't protect those rights, then the people have an obligation to get rid of that government and replace it with one that will. Thus, your government only operates as long as you allow it to. And if it's not doing its job, you have a responsibility to change that. And if you think about this, it doesn't take much of a leap to see how this is the basis for the American Revolution. Americans believed that the British Crown were violating their natural rights. Thus, they overthrew the government and replaced it with one that was based on their consent that would protect their natural rights. We'll come back to that later on and see how Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence pulls pretty directly from this conception of freedom and specifically from John Locke's second treatise of government. All right, number four, what concepts and institutions dominated colonial politics in the 18th century? First of all, suffrage or the right to vote. This was present in the colonies. However, it was typically only for property or landowning men in most colonies. And thus, colonial governments were mostly out of touch with most people from day to day, really only representing the interest of wealthy elites. Another dominant political institution of the colonies was the practice of something that I had mentioned in an earlier chapter called salutary neglect. Salutary neglect, thought of simply, is that the British kind of let the colonists run their own affairs. They allow them a great degree of independence and autonomy, and allow them to really kind of govern themselves. So colonial assemblies had quite a bit of power, specifically something called the power of the purse, because most of these colonies would have a royal governor or a governor that was appointed by the king. However, the colonial assemblies were the ones who controlled the purse strings. If the governor wanted to spend any money, he always had to get the permission of the colonial assembly. And that, in the kind of political power struggle, really gives the legislature or the colonial assemblies the upper hand and really kind of sets a precedent that this is ruled by the people, not by some representative from the king. The colonies also had relatively free political discourse and debate in public as opposed to their English counterparts. Um, Political discourse was very common in clubs and taverns, etc., as well as in the press, like newspapers and library books. And keep in mind, the colonies had a higher literacy rate on average than England did. So these ideas could spread much faster and much more widely than they could back in Europe. That said, your freedom of speech and the freedom of the press were not guaranteed in any of the colonies. And you could be legally suppressed, or speech could be legally suppressed in most circumstances. So even though there was relatively free political discourse, it wasn't protected by the law just yet. Finally, here for number 4, I mentioned that John Locke was an Enlightenment philosopher. The Enlightenment was a very influential political movement in the colonies. So Enlightenment thinking was very influential to many educated, wealthy elites. And the Enlightenment was a philosophy that tried to apply scientific reasoning to human behavior and human institutions. So rather than basing government off of tradition or superstition or the idea of divine right, we would apply scientific reasoning to things and try to work out what the natural law of human behavior was. In the same way, the scientific revolution had worked out what's the natural law of gravity and light and thermodynamics and those kinds of things. Well, if the universe operates by certain set rules, as the scientific revolution argued, then shouldn't humans also behave in the same kind of way? Number 5, how did the Great Awakening challenge the religious and social structure of British North America? So the Great Awakening was a series of religious revivals throughout the colonies that tried to, or rather that sought a more emotional approach to Christianity. And it was a response largely to the rationality of the Enlightenment, which in many senses was kind of anti-religion, kind of anti-superstitious. So the Great Awakening is kind of a response not only to the rationality of the Enlightenment, but also declining church membership. One lead figure in the Great Awakening is Jonathan Edwards. His work, or rather his sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, depicts the average person, a sinner, as a disgusting little spider that's suspended over a pit of fire by an angry, omnipotent God who could drop you into the fire and destroy you at any moment, as you would deserve, because you're a disgusting little spider sinner thing. But he doesn't. And it's supposed to be the emotional reaction to God's infinite mercy that's going to give you a greater connection with your God and your religion. So that's one kind of example of how they tried to use emotionality as the guiding principle behind Christianity rather than, like rational, reasoned out doctrine or dogma. So this Great Awakening, or the First Great Awakening, because there'll be a second one later on, the First Great Awakening is going to be sparked by an English evangelist named George Whitefield. And it's going to have the effect of splitting the Congregationalist Church, which is just a new name for the Puritans. It's going to split the Congregationalists into traditionalists, called Old Lights, and revivalists, called New Lights. So Old Lights were very critical of the Great Awakening. They were criticizing its lack of theological training. The idea that just, any Joe Schmo who could read the Bible and preach well could lead a religious congregation. They thought that that was ridiculous, that you needed education in this, and it couldn't be based only on emotion. New Lights are, of course, the opposite perspective, that it is emotion, not rationality, that connects us most to our God. And it split the Congregationalist Church into a variety of different Protestant denominations. So here is where we begin to get the Baptist Church, the Methodist Church, and so on and so forth. Another really important impact is going to be that the First Great Awakening really kind of introduces and normalizes the idea that authority can be questioned by common people. So the authority of the clerical hierarchy can be questioned by the average person who's reading and interpreting the Bible on their own and having their own emotional kind of reaction to it. And really, if you can question the clergy or question God, then it's it's easy to question government. So this idea that the average person's interpretation and emotional reaction to something is valuable and can be used to question authority and tradition, that's simply going to take on a political context when we get to the eve of the revolution, and it will be well established by that time. Finally, number 6. Here's where we're going to end period 2, and it's a really nice cutoff because it sets the stage perfectly for the revolution. This is the 7 Years' War. What kind of impact does it have on the relationship between the colonists and the English, as well as the relationship between white colonists and their Native American neighbors? Um, this is our first war, our first big war that we're looking at, and it's a good time to mention that in APUSH we really don't look at military history. When we look at wars, we're concerned with the causes and we're concerned with the effects. We really don't look at battles or troop movements or generals or anything like that. So for those of you that are really into military history, sorry, but as interesting as that might be, we don't really have the time for it, and it is certainly not what the APUSH exam focuses on. And I'm focused on getting you guys to a 3, 4, or 5 on the exam. And so we're going to kind of skip the fighting of the war for the most part. But anyway, the 7 Years' War was called the French and Indian War in our little corner of North America. It was a large globe-spanning war between two imperial rivals, or rather more than two, but the two big ones were England and France. So this is a face-off across the world, as you can see on the map here, between the French and the English. And that face-off in North America is going to be the French and Indian War. This is going to be sparked by a territorial dispute in the Ohio River Valley between between British and the French colonists. The war will develop in North America as the French and British armies face off against one another with their allies. The French are going to be allied with Native Americans. Keep in mind, New France and French colonies in general had overwhelmingly positive relationships with their Native American neighbors because they needed to. Their empires were based on trade, the fur trade. They had to have good relationships with Native Americans if they wanted to be able to trade with them. So Native American cultures overwhelmingly allied themselves with the French. Some will with the British, but far, far fewer. And the British Army really had to rely on colonial militias and colonial soldiers in this war. In the end, Britain wins, and France, as you can see from the map here, have to give up their North American empire. So all of this territory that you see in yellow as Louisiana is going to pass over mostly to the British and some to Spain, who had been allies of the British in this conflict. So Britain really now had everything east of the Mississippi River. They had dramatically expanded the size of their North American empire in defeating the French in this war. That said, in the immediate aftermath of the war, we have another Native American uprising called Pontiac's Rebellion. This is a Native American response to the sudden new rule of the British. Keep in mind that the French in the peace treaty had given up all this land that they didn't control. France gave all this Native American land away to the British without consulting Native American tribes. And Native Americans, understandably, were very concerned about what this meant for their future, as the British had traditionally been this frontier of exclusion and been far more hostile to Native American cultures than the French had been. Again, very much like King Philip's War, this is a two-pronged rebellion. Part of it is military, political. The other part of it is spiritual and cultural. So Pontiac leads the military resistance, whereas another Native American leader called Neolin led the spiritual resistance. And again, there was an emphasis on the purification of Native cultures of white ways that were considered to be negative influences. Pontiac's rebellion will inspire the British Parliament to pass the Proclamation of 1763. Not very originally named, but the Proclamation Line of 1763 drew the so-called Proclamation Line along the Appalachian Mountains in order to ensure peace with Western tribes. So you can see from the map on the right that Proclamation Line of 1763. Anything east of that was colonial territory, whereas anything west of that was supposed to be reserved for Native American cultures. As you might expect, many British colonists ignored this line and settled west of it anyway. Many of them felt that they had earned rights to the land in the French and Indian War. After all, the war had started based on a territorial dispute in the Ohio River Valley, which is west of the Proclamation Line. And that's going to lead to increased conflict with Native Americans and British colonists. One probably good example of this is the Paxton Boys. The Paxton Boys were Western Pennsylvania farmers who demanded the removal of Native Americans on the western frontier of Pennsylvania after the French and Indian War. The Colonial Assembly resisted this, but they ultimately relented after several violent actions by the Paxton Boys against Native American neighbors. And the Paxton Boys and the Pennsylvania government's removal of Native Americans on their frontier kind of ends this so-called holy experiment of good relations between Pennsylvania colonists and Native Americans. Finally, worth mentioning is that the French and Indian War helped to strengthen ties between the colonists across regions. You had colonists from the South fighting in parts of New England. You had middle colonists fighting in the South. So there was this sense that they were all in this together. They were all fighting for common territory and a common identity. And that's going to be important when the revolution comes around, as they can all kind of unite around those same sorts of sensibilities. So we'll end here, but I do want to make the caveat that the French and Indian War is technically period 3. Because period 2 ends in 1754, that means the French and Indian War comes after period 2. But this is still a useful point to cut things off. So when we begin period 3, we will begin it with the understanding that the French and Indian War is part of period 3, but it's already happened. We've already covered it. Let's start looking at the Revolution. But with the end of chapter 4 here and the end of period 2, I think we've pretty well established what the shape of the British colonies in North America look like, and that way we have good context and a good setting on the eve of the Revolution, which we'll look at starting in period 3.